I'm Jonathan. I'm principal consultant at Turner & Townsend. I work in the kind of grant allocations team, of which kind of phase approvals is one of the things I look after. So agenda for today. We've got phase request background, so kind of understanding the reason for phasing, and I think that's kind of useful to start off with. The phase request approach, kind of key policy reminders, that's the kind of key elements we look at whilst we are processing your phase requests, kind of the phasing baseline form, if you haven't already done that. The phase request kind of form is no longer a form, but the phase request kind of application process via the grant recipient portal. Some kind of key areas that we're kind of seeing crop up that are kind of requiring returns. So hopefully you can learn from those and not make those mistakes. Interaction with the kind of retrofit and design, the pre-installation, pre-install building inspection kind of elements, kind of the KPIs 1 and 2, really. Just a bit of clarification around that. And the interaction following a phase approval with payment drawdown, and then some other resources that you can utilize going forward. So background to phases. So the Warm Home Social Housing Fund Wave 3 scheme guidance kind of introduces a new application process to accommodate a phased approach to delivery, principally so that you were able to put less information in the bid documents because you might have not done all of your retrofit assessments, have all your kind of your data ready. So this is the phased approach is an opportunity to gather that information throughout the delivery of this kind of 3-year warm home scheme, and then utilize that to give more accurate information in kind of smaller chunks as we move through delivery. So that's the kind of principal reason for it, and hopefully that results in the requirement for fewer change requests later down the line, as at the point of creating a number of baselines that you would have already had some significant amount of upfront information. We shouldn't have properties dropping out because they're EPCC. They shouldn't have properties hopefully dropping out, although there's always the chance that it would happen that due to tenant refusals, because there's been kind of some level of tenant sign up prior to putting those properties forward. So that's the principal thought process behind phasing. So some kind of key points to kind of remember as we go through. So one, 4-1 submission per phase. So you've got, and actually one property can only be included in one phase. So we don't split properties up in between a number of different phases, doing different measures within different phases. One property per phase. Set forecasts after retrofit assessments and tenant sign-ups carried out for selected properties. So that's actually KPIs 1 and 2. We're able to set forecasts in relation to the cost of those measures, the amount of grant funding you're looking to draw down in relation to those starting and ending EPCs, etc. Sets more detailed baselines the project will be monitored against. So things like number of measures. You would have already put some baselines down already in terms of what you expect to draw down grant funding wise in years 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, those don't change as part of the phase request process unless you then go through, let's say, a change request if that needs to be moved around. But yeah, anything in terms of number of properties, types of measures, etc., they're all able to be set as part of this kind of phase request process. Sets more detail. Sorry, I've already said that. Costs, confirm costs after commercial arrangements are agreed. As I said, yeah, the process is there to allow you to collect that information up front, and then hopefully you'll know what the costs are going to be as part of the delivery. We understand there's always some flexibility there, but actually there should be much less requirement for kind of major changes once you realise that actually a measure is either not required or significantly more expensive, etc., than initially thought. And it unlocks the GR ability to draw down grant funding for that specific phase. So that's the outcome of a phase, is that it gets approved, hopefully, and then you're able to then draw down the amount of grant funding that was included within that phase. That kind of unlocks that element, and you can start drawing down and getting on with delivery, which is really what we all want to be doing. So the current approach, so we are kind of probably halfway through this now in terms of the kind of process of kind of phase requests. So guidance, kind of DESNZ issues guidance pack. So that's already kind of gone out. Kind of originally there was a number of webinars, etc., Q&As kind of earlier on this year. And then we move on to submission. I'll also, at the end of this, I'll share links to the DESNZ created guides in terms of how you kind of navigate the grant recipient portal, etc. It is at the bottom of these slides, but I'll put it in the chat as well, just so you've got access to those if it's the first time that you're kind of navigating the grant recipient portal in regards to phase requests submission. So yeah, this is probably where most of you are at, or at least submission through to evaluation. So you would submit your phase request. Hopefully you'd be having discussions with your DSM in terms of this is what we're looking to do. If you've got any particular queries, please fire those through to your DSM. They are your kind of point of contact throughout this whole process. You'll submit that phase request once you've done a good number of retrofit assessments, hopefully 100%, but it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% of those KPI 1 and 2. So that's principally retrofit assessments, at least a level design, enough to be able to understand what the costs are going to be, what the measures are going to be, what the starting and finishing EPCs are going to be, and then a tenancy sign up, again, as I've said, so that the tenants are aware of the works and not going to refuse those later down the line. Your DSM will do initial review and evaluation of that. If there are any errors, if there are any errors, then that will get returned to you with some notes in terms of what needs to be improved. If not, it will get kind of escalated up the chain and approved either by a member of my team, or depending on if there are any kind of elements of risk that we've identified, that would be particularly regarding breaking kind of cost cap rules. It is allowable within kind of phase requests, but the more you break it, the higher the risk is in terms of, are you then able to come back down in terms of, A&A, in terms of cost caps, etc., as well as kind of any particularly kind of interesting measures or things that might crop up that aren't aligned to PAS, etc. So that's the kind of main process, and then you'll be kind of informed along the way in terms of whether it's returned, whether it's been approved, whether it's been escalated, and kind of the exact reasons for that. So key policy reminders. As I said, these kind of elements are kind of heavily involved in the risk assessment process that we have to follow. So the key purpose is to bring properties to EPCC, it says or above there, but principally EPCC. There is, within the guidance, it does talk about, if you're taking properties above EPCC, then there's some guidance in the guidance document kind of that covers that. In principle, and I'll cover this a little bit later on, we just need to understand the justification. If you are taking properties above EPCC, it's not expected that you should be chucking measures in just because you're able to draw down the grant for it. I guess the department really want you to do as many properties EPCC as possible rather than fewer to EPCB. But if actually it makes sense to do it, and it's the fact that you've put some PV on and it's bumped it up to EPCB, then we are allowed to look at those on a case by case basis. And that they can be approved. So there's flexibility within the scheme there. So cost caps, you've got, I'm sure you're all aware of this, £7,500 for the kind of energy efficiency pot. Again, that's 50% kind of co-funded. £7,500 for kind of off-gas low carbon heating pot. Again, 50% match funded. And then there's the kind of 10% of the project can fall into the on-gas low carbon heating pot, which you get kind of £20,000 fully funded. So you don't have to add co-funding to those. And again, as I'm sure you're all aware, it cannot be more than 50% of total project spend. So that's your total grant funding plus the total co-funding, so including both capital costs of retrofits and A&A costs. So it can't be more than those two costs combined. Grant recipients are not required to meet these policy thresholds in any one phase. So as I said, you can, for instance, if you're doing a particularly expensive phase that focused on external wall insulation, it took you over some of those cost caps. As long as, again, you're able to justify that, these are higher costs for this reason in this phase. However, all future phases are lower cost measures, let's say cavity wall and loft top-ups, and therefore, we're going to come below the cost caps by project close. Again, that's fine. And depending on the level of that, it still might kind of escalate to the department just for them to have their final say. But in reality, as long as you're able to adequately justify it, there should be no issue. I think the only threshold that kind of isn't flexible is the 70 or 80% of homes. So 70% of non-social homes within the block or terrace. So if you're doing, and I doubt many people will in social housing be doing 70% non-social homes, but if you were considering that's kind of a hard line. If you had a block of flats with 80% non-social homes, which you wanted to do external wall insulation, that wouldn't be possible within the policy. And infill, again, so non-social homes within an application can be a maximum of 30%. Again, that is flexible with any one phase, as long as you justify that you'll come below that by project close. Non-social homes within a block of a terrace is 70%. As I've said, that's not flexible. And homes at or above EPCC within an application of 10%, again, that is flexible, but again, must show justification as to that you are going to be able to come under that by project closure. So the phasing baseline form, this is something that's, I guess, relatively new, and it's not mentioned within the guidance document, I don't believe. But when you submitted, I think, your GFAs or kind of scaled bids, you obviously had to put in kind of quarters when you were expecting to submit your phases. Given that was only kind of quarter information, the department now, from everyone, needs the kind of a revised phasing baseline to show when you expect to submit your phases, when you expect those to start, when you expect those to end, and the total number of properties per phase. So this is an opportunity for you to kind of re-evaluate kind of what you'd initially put in your kind of bid or GFAs and say, okay, this is more reasonable in terms of our delivery, and that can be done without so changes can be made without having to go through the project change control kind of process. If you are in a position where you're looking to kind of de-scope, etc. for year one, obviously that does need to go through that process. But just to kind of move homes around, add some more phases, etc., that is allowable within this process. There is an expectation, and it's within the guidance, that you will have a kind of maximum of 10 phases, and phases will be kind of a minimum of 10% of the project. Again, that is an expectation. There is flexibility there. If you wanted to put a slightly smaller phase in because you want to get started more quickly and you've got those retrofit assessments already whilst you collect the others, again, that is possible. Please talk to your DSM and we can look at that. Obviously, we don't expect to see a phase baseline with 100 phases. It would be kind of excessive admin for yourself and everyone else. But kind of a sensible approach. There's flexibility within there. But in terms of completing that phasing baseline, all the kind of the submission dates, the start dates, end dates, obviously all must be in the future. That might seem counterintuitive if you've already kind of started doing retrofit assessments, even if you've started to deliver at risk. Just for the kind of system purposes, those dates must be in the future. Start dates, they should be in the format day, month, year. It just gets confusing if you have a kind of a month, day, etc. In terms of what that should be. So just make sure it's in that format. The start date must follow the submission date. So we recommend 12 days between. That allows for the approval process, basically. Again, it won't really impact. When I say you can't start until the date you started, if your phase gets passed within, say, 3 days, it doesn't really affect that. It just allows for the approval process. So ideally, about 12 days after you've said you're going to submit it, you can put the start date in. And again, it won't affect delivery. It's purely for kind of the system purposes more than anything else. The final phase end dates should match. It matches the project end year. So again, we'll be checking to make sure that there's kind of no changes there. Total number of home matches the GFA total, again, so that we'll be checking those. If you are changing the number of total homes you're looking to deliver, that again, that's a kind of would go down the project change request process. So this is really an opportunity to give kind of actual dates, so you can have kind of foresight of when you expect to do that, and also kind of add more phases if you've kind of underestimated the task at hand, or kind of changed properties per phase, etc. And it's also check for kind of basic policy rules regarding phases. But in reality, as I said, there's an expectation of that 10%, minimum 10%, and maximum of 10 phases. There is flexibility there to reduce that if needed, and if it makes sense for your project. So certainly pragmatic in how we approach that. So the phase request form, you may have seen it previously kind of in Excel format. We've all moved now to the grant management system, or the kind of grant recipient portal. So everything will be kind of done via that system. You have kind of a number of pages that you go through in the kind of phases tab. And I'll share the link in terms of the guide has created kind of a walkthrough of that system. It's quite good actually in terms of kind of walking you through how to click through and what information to put in. But you kind of the first element you get to after kind of the guidance page, which again is worth reading and not just kind of clicking next, just to make sure you fully understand kind of types of information you're going to be asked for. You've got declarations and delivery confidence and the confidence self-evaluation. So this is where you're declaring, for instance, KPIs 1 and 2 have been completed. If you click yes, it's just a yes. We don't require any further information. It is a declaration, kind of trusting you to be honest in terms of the information you provide in that. So you wouldn't be asked to give a full list of the retrofit assessments that have been done, etc. If you click no, box will pop up for some justification. So please do utilize that. We need to, if you do click no, it's part of kind of marking process. We need to understand the justification for no, and that there are numerous reasons why you might have not necessarily got 100% of retrofit assessments or 100% of resident signups. As long as you're able to adequately justify why that is, and the fact that you're on with getting them, you're confident within the information that has been provided, etc., then that should be fine. You'll also have a kind of the self-evaluation element as well at the bottom, or I think the next page on from the key declarations page. Again, there's a kind of a justification element for why you've marked yourself at a green or amber green, etc. Please utilize that. Ideally, more information, the better. Again, it just gives the kind of assessors more of an idea of why you've come to that conclusion. I'll cover that in a later slide as well. You've got KPIs, phase and homes costs. So there's a box of kind of for KPIs 2, 3, so 3, 4, 5. Unless you've kind of started at risk, or you're kind of into phase 2, 3, you won't need to be putting any numbers in there. I think you do have to put kind of a 0. It won't let you move on if you haven't put anything in there. But just if there's nothing to put in, put a 0. That's fine. You'll be asked in terms of the cost associated with the phase. So that'll be any kind of capital grant drawdown, A&A grant drawdown, co-funding, and then it will add up some of the total grant costs. Please only include costs associated with the phase. We have seen a number come through where they've kind of done kind of years 1, 2, 3. I know it's not necessarily once you're in the question very clear. The guidance does kind of say that it should just be for the phase, but please only include costs associated with the phase. Again, go back to the thinking about the principle of what a phase is. It's so you can get more accurate data. If you're including costs that haven't gone through the retrofit assessment process and measures, etc., it's not going to be accurate data. So just include costs associated with this phase, and the next phase will be the next costs, etc. So as you go through, that'll all add up in the background. Then you've got kind of spend and grant drawdown. So this is when you expect to draw down grant. Again, the phase request just unlocks the ability to draw down. So if you get it wrong by £1,000 here, there, it's not a problem. It's a guesstimate of what you're expecting to draw down when. Just make sure that it lines up with what you've said you're going to claim in grant in the phase. So those numbers in a total grant to be claimed and total grant drawdown, those numbers should align. We also would kind of expect you to be drawing that down in kind of in chunks generally, but again, it depends on how you're delivering your project. But as long as it makes sense, also just to kind of remember that any drawdowns that happen in February that you're expecting any drawdown submissions, should I say, that you're expecting to submit in February and March wouldn't get paid to the next financial year. So any drawdown submissions should be kind of by January, really. Then you've got the type and condition of homes to be upgraded. So this is where you'd put starting and ending at EPCs. Again, if you've got any properties that are starting at EPCC or ending at EPCB or non-social homes, etc., just make sure you provide justification for that. So, for instance, if they are starting at C, again, it would just I guess in almost all cases, it would be that it's part of a block or part of a row of terraces, and you can't deliver works to the ones that are below EPC C without tackling the ones that are above EPCC. And again, if you're going over those thresholds, then again, just justify within that box just to say, we know we're over the threshold. We're confident we'll come down by project closure, etc. And that is pretty much the form. I think it looks a little bit more complicated than it is once you get into it. And once you've done kind of the first phase, I think they should flow quite easily. But happy to kind of answer some questions at the end if you've got any particular issues. So just to kind of jump into some kind of key elements where we found maybe people not providing enough information or kind of getting things wrong. So yeah, just some kind of key elements. So for those kind of KPI 1 and 2 questions, so KPI 1, I confirm that all homes in this phase are suitable for retrofit. I completed retrofit assessments and confirmed EPC rating. Either you click yes, in which case it's fine, or you click no. We have a kind of a sliding scale in terms of how we would risk assess those. So obviously the less retrofit assessments you've got, less design information, the less confident you could be in terms of the costs and the measure mixes, etc. But if you're able to provide kind of justification that as to why that is, and maybe some more information in terms of we've got 90%, but they're all the same archetype, etc., just what would make you confident in the information that you're putting forward. I would say that if you have fewer than 50% retrofit assessments and tenant signups, that is an automatic return. So we can't accept any phase requests that kind of fall below that. But the more the better. Obviously, the more you have, more likely you are to have a kind of a green risk rating, and they can just get approved more quickly. I confer. So the next one is again very similar, but in terms of kind of more in terms of the follow-on design work and principally resident sign-up. So I confirm that all homes, including this phase, are ready for installations to start, which includes securing 100% resident sign-ups. Again, same information if you haven't got those, what you're doing in order to get that and why you're confident in that you'll be able to deliver what is being proposed. Phase request matches my phase request baseline. So once you've submitted your phasing baseline that I discussed earlier, that's kind of then classed as reset. So even if it's not as kind of previously outlined in the GFA, that's fine. As I said, there's no requirement to go through a PCR. If you have kind of done those changes and then you are making kind of major changes to following submitting that phasing baseline, other than kind of moving properties between phases. So if you're adding more phases, if you're changing dates dramatically, or if you've got anything that will impact financial year spend, that would then require a PCR to go through, and the phase request, if you submit it at the same time, would be put on hold until the outcome of the PCR. All measure types included in this phase outlined in section 4 compliant with the eligible measure. So basically what we're going to be doing there is obviously you can say yes, and hopefully you are submitting compliant ones. We'd also check the baseline measures that you submitted to make sure that those are kind of PAS compliant. What we don't want to see in that baseline measures is you've got an opportunity to kind of add other measures, which is fine, but please don't include like A&A costs or kind of retrofit design costs. The department don't want to see that. This is more for them to understand the costs associated with the kind of key measures. So kind of PAS eligible measures, design costs, etc., don't need to be included in that area. I confirm all key project roles, including primary contract, can basically are there or thereabouts. So if you just about to Hopefully you've already got your contractor in place because you've already got you doing your retrofit assessments, etc. In which case we've just asked you to make sure you put down who the contractors are, at least the principal contractors. We don't need to see subcontractors, etc. Or if you're not at that point yet, there'd probably be very few if you're submitting a phase. But again, justification as to as to why that is, but and also that when you expect to start the phase, that a contractor will be in place. So again, make sure you've got justification there to showcase that. I've received kind of countersigned copy of my GFA. Again, most of you should be in that position. What we've kind of slightly slackened on is the kind of FRA and FMP. So as long as you've kind of in the process of kind of submitting that and it's going through the review, we can still process your phase request. That's not a problem. Obviously, you would need the FRA and FMP to have been signed off in order to do the kind of the drawdowns, but we can certainly process the phase request and get that moving whilst the FRA and FMP stuff is still ongoing. And DCA self-assessment, I've already discussed that element, so I won't go into it in too much more detail, but yeah, just the more information, the better. Things you could think about in terms of what would make it a risky or less risky would be number of homes, simple versus complex to install measures. Obviously, the fact that you've already got 100% retrofit assessments rather than sign-ups. Maybe things like the kind of geographical spread archetype. So, for instance, they're all in the same area, they're all the same archetype. The supplier is kind of well versed in delivering this type of works, etc. KPIs and phase homes and costs. So this is kind of the next section after the declaration section. So KPI update for the project so far is generally expected to be 0. So those KPI 3, 4, and 5 information is, as I've said previously, unless you've done some work, in which case you can put that in. But I expect to see more of those KPI information being added to the following phases as you get into delivery. Again, that's for information purposes only. Homes in this phase, so input the total number of homes to be included in the current phase only again. So we're only looking for information associated with this phase, and that follows then on into the phase costs. So this is to check you're on track. You're not going to be exceeding baseline figures, etc. You're not going to be kind of massively breaking cost caps, which would then be difficult to kind of come back in line with. They're the type of things that we're looking at for your phase costs. Grant drawdown, again, I've kind of touched on this previously. It should just match up with your financial year grant information that you put in the previous page. It should be a sensible timeline. And again, just kind of a reminder that there's that kind of 2-month delay between a drawdown request and receiving that money. So you kind of need to project kind of what would be your kind of costs incurred within those months after your drawdown request goes in. So yeah, for instance, we've got an example here. So grant recipients may submit drawdown requests in month 1 and include spend that will be incurred up to the end of month 2. So grant drawdown should match the total grant funding in the phase cost section. So no drawdowns that are listed in the wrong financial year. Again, we'd be looking at that in terms of, have you put drawdowns that don't match up, and drawdowns do not exceed financial year and or total project balances. So again, we understand what your financial year kind of baseline is, and if you're looking to draw down more than that, again, that would be a big red flag, unless you'd already gone through a PCR and it had been agreed. Grant drawdown. So for example, this is an example of particularly where kind of most importantly for February. So if a drawdown request was submitted in June, payments were made in August. With the above in mind, this means that final drawdown request for spend incurred, and that's particularly important. We're talking about spend incurred. It doesn't necessarily have to have been invoiced and paid yet, just that the works have been completed and therefore the spend has technically been incurred in the current financial year, must be submitted in January. So to ensure that grant recipients can draw down spend, they will incur up to the end of the financial year. For this drawdown, DESNZ will accept spend that will be incurred up to the 31st of March to be included in this drawdown request. So yeah, final drawdown really for this financial year, January, is what that is saying. Stock condition and measures. So this is where we're asking for your starting EPC, ending EPCs. So again, as I've said previously, if you have got properties that are starting at EPC C or above, just make sure you're providing clear justification for their inclusion. Again, if you are breaching those kind of cost caps or kind of policy requirements, so you can 30% non-social homes, etc., then just make sure you are justifying that as well. So for instance, we're aware that we are breached this, but it will come under by project close because this is just a one-off project that has a large number of non-social homes, etc. Ending EPC again, just make sure you're providing clear justification. It's not as clear that you need to provide justification within the kind of phase application process. Just make sure you include it in the kind of justification box where you'd also talk about the EPC C properties or the non-social home properties. We just do need to see justification. I don't want to have to kind of return phases that just because they've got some EPC B/A properties that have an adequate justification. Again, that could be in terms of the fabric didn't get it to EPCC, but now we've put on PV and it's kind of due to the SAP increases, it's taking it to B. That also might be kind of measure mixes that work well together. For instance, air source heat pumps and solar PV, you want to combine those, but actually that's just bumping it up to a B. That's adequate justification. What we don't want to see is just adding measures because it's your internal target to take properties to B. Non-social homes provide clear justification for their inclusion, and measure types. All measure types are eligible, kind of past 2030, 2035 compliant. Do measures make sense when comparing with kind of phase start date? So we'll have a little look at that in terms of, if you've got a really short phase and you're looking to do a significant amount of, external wall insulation in the winter, we might question the deliverability of that phase. Also, we'll be looking at, do the number of low carbon heating measures align with the number you've put in terms of what you're claiming for cost caps? So making sure that those numbers align as well. We're not particularly focusing on value for money, although if you've got some crazy costs in there, we will kind of just query that, but obviously some of that will come out when analysing against cost caps. Phase risk levels. So as I kind of said, as we go through and mark or assess the phase requests that come in, each question gets its own kind of RAG rating, which then kind of results in a number of different outcomes. So there is a green, which is low risk. It's principally, you've got loads and loads of information. You're not breaking hardly any of the cost caps or breaching any of the kind of main policy thresholds. They should generally, and all the measures make sense, etc., that they should generally go through as green, in which case it's kind of general turnaround is 7 working days. Then you've got kind of an escalation process from that, from amber green to amber to red, again, depending on the number of different elements in which you may be breaching or which maybe you haven't provided adequate justification, or the number of kind of KPI 1 and 2 data sets that you've got will result in them kind of being risk assessed. And obviously, the more risky they are, they have to go through other approval processes which take longer. So it could be up to kind of 17 working days, depending on how it gets risk assessed. But you'll be made aware of kind of the outcome of those as they go through the process. So interaction with kind of retrofit design and kind of pre-installation building inspections. So obviously past 2035 is a relatively complex process, kind of number of touch points. So you've got the retrofit assessment and coordination piece, and there's a number of things that fall under that in terms of design. If you're doing fabric works, also probably low carbon heating as well, there'll be kind of follow-on kind of technical surveys, probably done by either the measure installer, so whether that's an air source heat pump installer or external wall installer. Obviously not everything can be picked up at kind of retrofit assessment phase, so there are some kind of follow-on surveys after the retrofit assessment. In terms of what we class as kind of qualifying as having completed KPI 1 and KPI 2, we'll leave it up to your judgment. If you're happy that the data that you've got is accurate, then obviously we're not asking you to provide that information. So it's for instance, if you obviously got all the retrofit assessments done, it's a big row of terraces, and you've done some pre-installation building inspections on a couple of those, but they're all the same archetype, then I would suggest that, in terms of the accuracy of that information, you could probably say that kind of KPI 1, and there's, we're confident in the starting and ending EPCs, we're confident in the measure mixes, we're confident in the costs. That would be fine. And again, in terms of what does a resident sign up look like, it's entirely up to you. Again, we're not going to be asking you to there's not like a prescriptive resident sign up letter. It's entirely up to you in terms of your resident engagement practices, how you go about kind of getting agreement from the residents. So let's take a pragmatic approach to this. It's all about just having confidence in the data that you're providing. As long as you are confident in it, and you've leased on the retrofit assessments, you've got those EPC starting and ending modelling done, etc. Then more than happy for people to take a pragmatic approach based on your kind of own kind of risk thresholds. And so last but not least is kind of interaction with kind of payment drawdown. So the phase request process and the payment drawdowns are separate within the kind of grant recipient portal. So all that the phase request process does is unlock the ability to draw down the amount of money you want to draw down in that phase. So once you've done that, then obviously when you're ready to draw down, you would do a kind of payment drawdown submission with the grant recipient portal. As I say, that'll get processed, and payment should be made kind of 2 months down the line, prior to having your first phase request. So there will be costs you're incurring now whilst you're preparing a first phase. So retrofit assessments, staff time, etc. You are able to draw down prior to submitting a first phase, up to 20% of total grant funding. So actually quite a lot. So you can maximum 50% A&A and 5% capital that you can draw down prior to having your first phase request. So if you have incurred costs already, I would certainly recommend that you get moving and put in some payment drawdowns for those costs already incurred. And that's the kind of payment drawdown in a nutshell. So further resources is some useful links here. And so obviously, if you haven't already done so, kind of reading through the SHF Wave 3 guidance document just to refresh yourself in terms of what it says, thresholds, cost caps, etc. And then the grant recipient portal guides, which I will link in the chat in a second. They're just the kind of walkthroughs in terms of how you submit a phase request and numerous other things that you'll be doing in the grant recipient portal. Obviously, there's loads and loads of resources on the RISE website covering everything from procurement through to the delivery and PAS and all that good stuff. So certainly, if you've got kind of questions, that would be a good first port of call to see if there's a masterclass that answers your question. I'll also be doing some phase drop-ins, so those should be appearing in terms of the upcoming events as well, going into October. So again, if you have any particularly burning questions as you go through the process, I would certainly utilize those drop-ins, and I'll be hosting those phase drop-ins in October. But I think that's the end of the presentation.